Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a book that's over 200 years old, but still feels incredibly relevant today.
You're talking about Adolphe, right? By Benjamin
You
Constant.
got it. Published way back in 1816.
Wow. Yeah, that's early 1800s?
It was actually released after the author died.
Posthumously.
Exactly. And you know what's even more interesting? Many people believe Adolphe is semi-autobiographical.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which adds another layer to its exploration of love, betrayal, and societal pressure, don't you think?
Absolutely. It makes you wonder how much of Constant's own life experiences seeped into the narrative.
Well, let's set the stage for those who might not be familiar with Adolphe. The story revolves around this young, intellectual guy named, you guessed it, Adolphe.
Clever title.
He finds himself in a passionate affair with a woman named Ellénore, who's 10 years older than him.
So right from the start, we've got this age gap, this element of forbidden love.
Exactly. And to complicate matters even further, Ellénore is actually involved with a powerful count when she meets Adolphe.
Talk about a recipe for scandal.
Right, so we're definitely not dealing with your typical lighthearted romance here.
Not at all. The novel really delves into this psychological drama, exploring the complexities of their relationship as it evolves. Initially, Adolphe craves this passionate escape, but then he starts to feel suffocated and longs for his freedom.
It's like that saying, easy come, easy go.
Well, perhaps in this case, it's more like forbidden love, complicated consequences.
Cliché. But what I find really fascinating about Constant's writing is how he portrays Adolphe. He's not just a simple villain.
Yeah, he's got depth.
He's smart, capable of genuine feeling, but also incredibly indecisive and, if we're being honest, a bit selfish.
I think a lot of readers find themselves both drawn to and frustrated by Adolphe. He's a very human character with all his flaws and contradictions.
Definitely. And it makes me wonder, how much of Constant himself did he pour into Adolphe, especially considering that potential autobiographical element we talked about earlier?
It's a question that lingers in the back of your mind as you read. But let's not forget about Ellénore, the other half of this tumultuous equation.
Right. She is an incredible woman,
Yeah.
intelligent, passionate, and willing to risk everything for Adolphe.
She's a force to be reckoned with, that's for sure. But as the story unfolds, we start to see how Eleanor's devotion to Adolphe becomes intertwined with insecurity and a sense of possessiveness.
That makes sense, given their age difference and the societal consequences she's facing for their affair.
Exactly. And remember, we're talking about the Napoleonic era, a time of massive social upheaval and very rigid expectations, particularly for women. Constant does a brilliant job of weaving this societal context into the narrative, showing how these external forces are impacting Adolphe and Eleanor's inner struggles.
Oh, for sure. The historical backdrop really adds another layer to the story.
Yeah.
Adolphe's affair with Eleanor isn't just a forbidden romance. It's also a rebellion against the societal norms of the time.
Right. It's a statement about individuality, freedom, and the consequences of defying convention. And it's all told through Constant's incredible writing, which is known for its psychological realism.
Yeah, I've heard people rave about those intense internal monologues.
Those monologues are where the true depth of Adolphe's character shines through. We're right there in his head, experiencing his doubts, his justifications, his moments of tenderness and cruelty.
So even though he makes some questionable choices, we still get a sense of the turmoil he's going through internally.
Absolutely. It's this internal struggle that makes him such a compelling, albeit flawed character. And speaking of delving deeper, did you know we actually have excerpts from two slightly different versions of Adolphe for this deep dive?
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, and they offer some fascinating insights into Constant's writing process and how his thoughts on the characters and themes may have evolved over time.
That's super interesting. I'm curious to hear more about these differences as we go along. But before we dive into those, I have to ask, is the writing style what you'd expect from a romantic novel of that era?
You might be surprised. While Adolphe is a love story at its core, Constant's writing is actually quite direct and introspective. There's a rawness to his prose that feels surprisingly modern, even though it was written over 200 years ago.
It sounds like he's peeling back the layers of romanticism to expose the raw, often messy, reality of relationships.
Exactly. He doesn't shy away from portraying the darker aspects of human nature, the limitations of societal expectations, and the consequences of our choices.
So even though it was written centuries ago, it still feels relevant to modern readers because it deals with these universal human experiences.
Absolutely. And that might have been part of why Adolphe was considered quite controversial when it was first published.
Really?
Yeah, it challenged the traditional views on love and relationships. People weren't used to seeing characters who were so flawed and morally ambiguous.
It sounds like Constance was kind of a literary rebel, pushing boundaries and sparking conversations about love, freedom, and the individual's place in society.
You could definitely say that, and that's part of what makes Adolphe so enduring. It's a novel that dares to ask difficult questions and present characters who grapple with those same questions even if they don't always find the answers.
It's like he's holding up a mirror to human nature, showing us both the beauty and the ugliness, and inviting us to reflect on our own experiences.
Precisely. And it's really interesting how Constant chose to tell this story.
What do you mean?
Well, the entire novel is told from Adolph's perspective.
So we're getting this very intimate first-hand account of his thoughts and feelings as he navigates this tumultuous relationship.
Exactly. But that also raises the question, are we getting a truly objective view of Ellénore?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Are we only seeing her through the lens of Adolphe's desires and perceptions?
That's a great point.
It's almost like Constant is deliberately playing with that subjectivity, forcing us to think about how our own biases shape our understanding of relationships.
So we're not just passive readers. We're actively trying to piece together the truth alongside Adolphe. But we also have to be aware that his version of events might not be the whole story.
Right. It's a really clever way of engaging the reader and making us think critically about the characters and their motivations.
It definitely adds a layer of complexity to the story. We're constantly questioning whether Adolphe's view of Ellénore, and even of himself, is truly accurate.
And that's what makes Adolphe so thought-provoking. It's not a simple love story with clear-cut heroes and villains. It's about exploring the gray areas of human emotion, those messy, complicated spaces where our desires and needs often clash with reality.
And I think that's one of the reasons why the novel still feels so relevant today, even though it was written over 2 centuries ago. It taps into these universal anxieties about love, freedom, and the choices we make that are still relevant to modern readers.
Absolutely. Constance's ability to capture Adolphe's inner turmoil is just incredible. It feels so real, so relatable, even across the centuries.
It really makes you wonder, how much of Constance's own personal experiences did he pour into Adolphe?
Especially considering all the evidence suggesting that it might be semi-autobiographical.
Exactly. It's like we're getting a glimpse into the author's own heart and mind, his own struggles with love and societal expectations.
Which adds another layer of depth and intrigue to the story.
For sure. And speaking of digging deeper, remember how we mentioned earlier that we have excerpts from 2 slightly different versions of Adolphe for this deep dive?
Oh yes, those variations are really fascinating.
What stands out to you about those differences?
Well, one thing that struck me is how Constance subtly shifts Adolphe's tone in one version when he's reflecting on his relationship with Ellénore.
What do you mean?
It's like he's trying to make Adolphe a bit more sympathetic to highlight the internal struggle he's going through.
So even though Adolphe makes some selfish choices, Constance still wants us to understand him, to see the humanity beneath his flaws.
I think so. It shows how much thought and care Constant put into crafting his characters. He wasn't just interested in telling a simple story. He wanted to explore the complexities of human nature.
And it's through those subtle details, those nuanced shifts in tone and perspective, that we get a real sense of Constance's mastery as a writer.
Absolutely. He doesn't tell us what to think or how to feel. He lets the characters reveal themselves through their actions and their thoughts. And it's up to us as readers to interpret their motivations and draw our own conclusions.
And, earlier you mentioned how Adolphe feels surprisingly modern. And I think that's partly due to Constance's honesty in portraying relationships. He doesn't romanticize things. He shows the messiness, the power dynamics, and the ways in which love can sometimes turn into something destructive.
Right. And that was probably pretty groundbreaking for its time.
Oh, for sure.
Remember, this was the early 1800s. Society had very strict expectations about how people, especially women, were supposed to behave, especially when it came to love and relationships.
And Ellénore certainly faces the brunt of those societal judgments.
Absolutely. She's ostracized for her affair with Adolphe. Her reputation is ruined, while he, as the man, faces far less scrutiny.
Such a double standard.
Right, and Constant doesn't shy away from exposing that hypocrisy. He shows how Eleanor's transgression is viewed much more harshly than Adolphe's, even though they're both equally complicit in the affair.
It's really a commentary on the power dynamics of the time and how society often held women to a different and often unfair standard.
And what's so brilliant is that Constant doesn't need to explicitly preach or moralize to get his point across. He simply presents the situation as it is, letting the reader draw their own conclusions about the injustice of it all.
It's that subtlety, that nuance, that makes Constance such a masterful storyteller.
And it's not just the personal dynamics that he captures so well. He also weaves in the larger societal context, the backdrop of the Napoleonic era, with all its upheaval and change.
Right. Adolphe isn't just wrestling with his own personal desires and anxieties,
He's also a product of his time.
trying to navigate these emerging ideas of individualism and personal freedom, which clash with the rigid social structures that still hold sway.
Exactly. His affair with Ellénore becomes a kind of microcosm of this larger societal struggle between tradition and change.
It's like he's rebelling against the expectations placed upon him.
But at the same time, he's trapped by his own desires and the consequences of his actions.
It's a really interesting paradox.
And it's a tension that still resonates with us today. Even though we live in a vastly different world, we still grapple with those same questions about individual freedom versus societal expectation.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder, if Adolphe were set in the 21st century, how would the story play out?
Would Adolphe and Ellénore be able to find happiness in a world that, at least on the surface, seems more accepting of unconventional relationships?
It's a fascinating thought experiment.
Oh, I think even today they would still face challenges, different pressures.
Perhaps.
The societal landscape might have shifted, but the fundamental human anxieties about love, commitment, and the search for meaning, those are timeless.
And that's ultimately why Adolphe continues to fascinate readers centuries after it was written.
It speaks to something universal about the human experience, something that transcends any specific time or place. It really is remarkable how a novel written in the early 1800s can still resonate so strongly with modern readers.
It's a testament to Constance's ability to capture those timeless human experiences, the complexities of love, the struggle for freedom, the weight of societal expectations.
Absolutely. And let's not forget the brilliant way he uses Adolphe's point of view to make us question our own perceptions and biases as readers.
Speaking of those different perspectives, one of the most fascinating things we discovered while preparing for this deep dive was the existence of those excerpts from two slightly different versions of Adolphe.
Oh, yes. Those variations were so intriguing.
What did you find particularly interesting about them?
Well, in one version, Constant adds a few lines that give us a more intimate glimpse into Ellénore's thoughts and feelings.
Oh, really? I don't remember noticing that.
It's very subtle, but it's significant because it shows that even though the story is filtered through Adolphe's perspective, Ellénore is more than just an object of his desire.
You're right, it makes her a more well-rounded character.
Exactly. It's like Constant is acknowledging that there's more to her story than what Adolphe perceives.
It reminds us that there are always multiple sides to every story, and that true understanding requires empathy and a willingness to look beyond our own limited perspectives.
I completely agree. And speaking of seeing things from different angles, let's talk about the ending of Adolphe.
Oh, yes, the ending. It's definitely not your typical happily ever after.
Not at all. Without giving too much away, let's just say that both Adolphe and Ellénore suffer the consequences of their choices.
And it's interesting how Constance chooses to end the novel.
What do you mean?
Well, instead of tying everything up neatly, he leaves us with a sense of ambiguity and unresolved questions.
Oh, right. Like with those letters included at the end, right?
Yes, from the unnamed editor and the novel's supposed publisher offering their interpretations of Adolphe's story.
It's as if Constant is inviting us to continue the conversation even after we've finished reading.
To grapple with the questions of morality, responsibility, and the lasting impact of our actions.
It's such a clever way to wrap up the story. It's like he's saying, okay, here's what happened, but now it's your turn to think about it. There are no easy answers here.
Exactly. He's challenging us to consider the complexities of the situation, to weigh the different perspectives, and to come to our own conclusions.
It's something that stays with you long after you've closed the book.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Adolphe, I have to ask, if you could pose one question to Benjamin Constant, what would it be?
That's a tough one. But I think I'd ask him about those letters at the end. What was his purpose in including them? Was he trying to make us question Adolphe's reliability as a narrator? Or was it more about offering different interpretations of the events?
That's a great question. I think I'd want to ask him about his decision to publish the novel posthumously. Was it a way of protecting himself from potential scandal? Or was it a deliberate choice to let the story speak for itself without the author's presence?
I guess we'll never know for sure, but that's part of the mystery and allure of Adolphe. It's a novel that continues to spark debate and inspire new interpretations even centuries after it was written.
And if our deep dive has piqued your interest, we encourage you to check out Adolphe for yourself. It's a timeless masterpiece that offers profound insights into love, freedom, and the human condition.
It's a story that will stay with you long after you've finished reading it.
So until our next deep dive, keep exploring and keep those conversations going.